This month marks the 10-year anniversary of my favourite game of all time, Bloodborne. And in lieu of any kind of an official announcement, I wanted to celebrate in my own way. Throughout the month, I'll be dropping several Bloodborne videos leading up to the game's anniversary, each one designed to celebrate one of the major pillars of what made Bloodborne so great, in my opinion at least. In today's video, I wanted to start with something a little more personal. A story from my time with Bloodborne's acclaimed DLC expansion, The Old Hunters, which I'll be taking a much deeper look at in future videos to come as well. You see, The Old Hunters was truly special for a number of different reasons. The incredible bosses that were introduced, the wonderful new areas to explore, the plethora of new and exciting weapons, the fantastic music, all of it came together to create what stands tall as still one of, if not the greatest piece of DLC ever made for a Soulsborne game. Though these days, maybe Shadow of the Erdtree has it beat. But that's neither here nor there. The Old Hunters was a remarkable achievement, taking the already impeccable masterpiece of Bloodborne and crafting something that didn't feel just like an add-on, it felt essential. That's why today, even beyond everything the base game brought to the table, the Old Hunters managed to become one of the core pillars that makes Bloodborne so great, in my opinion anyway, and should be experienced by all fans. And our story begins with my first outing into these twisted new lands some, well, almost 10 years ago now. I was waiting for the Old Hunters to finally release in November of 2015, I think it was. At the turn of midnight, I was there, ready to dive into the DLC. For you see, while the Old Hunters was truly special for those aforementioned reasons, for someone who had already sunk over 100 hours into Bloodborne at the time, got the platinum, and really seen all there was to see, it offered something else, something unexpected, something humbling. It reminded me of what it meant to play Bloodborne, to really play Bloodborne, as though I was experiencing it all again for the very first time. But what does that mean, I hear you asking? How did the DLC remind you of how to play a game, one that we already had so much experience with? And of course the DLC is not at the start of the game by any stretch of the imagination. You have to have already gone so deep into Bloodborne to reach it in the first place. Well, that's the story we're going to dive into in today's video. And really it all comes down to one particular boss. So, let's take a look at how Ludwig the Holy Blade reminded me of what it meant to play Bloodborne some 10 years ago. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't done already, make sure to hit subscribe down below, as it really does help the channel out. So if you want to be a part of the push to the channel's next major milestone of 15,000 subs, consider hitting subscribe now if you like what you see. I really would appreciate it. Now, I think it's important to set the stage with some much-needed context, first of all. Bloodborne was my first ever Souls game. I'd heard whispers of their unflinching difficulty in the past, and to be honest, that had kind of kept me at bay for the longest time. I'd heard of Dark Souls, of course, but I didn't really know the game at all. I had no idea who From Software were, and I had no expectations going in. However, of course, when Bloodborne launched, the year was 2015, the PS4 was barely 12 months old, and I was desperate for things to play, for new exclusives to play. Not only that, but I was still riding the hype train of the console's release. I loved my new machine and the momentum surrounding its enormous success out of the gate, and wanted to embroil myself in the ecosystem as much as possible. And that meant checking out the exclusives, few and far between. Now, that didn't mean I was going into Bloodborne completely blind. I watched every trailer, and I'm a real sucker for gothic Victorian settings, so that had me intrigued. It was the Gamescom gameplay trailer of August 2014 that really sold me on potentially liking the game, however. That was when I first realised actually this could be for me. And I then went hands-on for the first time at EGX in London in September of that same year. I was atrocious at it and had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to be doing, but I was undeterred and even more intrigued. Fast forward then to March of 2015, the game was here and still unsure as to how much I would really enjoy it or even get out of what promised to be a blisteringly hard experience. I used store credit to buy it, not wanting to spend my actual money at the time. And yet, despite all of that, despite it being my first venture into a game of the Souls ilk, well, I never found Bloodborne to be too cripplingly difficult. I was kind of surprised. No, perhaps difficult isn't the right word here. I never found the game to be frustrating, how about that? Because yes, it had a healthy level of challenge, and was certainly tougher and less forgiving than anything I had played in a long time, but for a game coming from a developer with a renowned history of making crushingly hard games, crucially I never found Bloodborne to be unfair or harsh. Instead, I was able to embrace the game for what it was. I learned, I grew, I took failure in my stride. Eventually, I found myself dancing around monstrous enemies, parrying hunters, and toppling shrieking, writhing bosses, learning their patterns, their quirks, and mastering their environments until I was able to crush them with what felt like so much as a swing. The same trajectory that I'm sure all of you also went on. Because that's how these games are intended to be played. You suffer, but you grow, you learn, and we all, I imagine, took that same path together. And yet, while we do ultimately walk that same path, the beauty of the Soulsborne games is that everyone's story is different. Father Gascoigne, the main boss of the first area, Central Yharnam, is often considered the game's reality check roadblock. The boss designed to weed out players that haven't yet learned the mechanics of Bloodborne. Specifically the parry, really, when it comes to this fight, the boss that so many players were meeting head on, and often leaving with their tail between their legs, enormously frustrated. It wouldn't surprise me if Father Gascoigne caused an innumerable amount of players to just drop the game forever. How can the first boss be this impossibly hard? In fact, if we take a quick look at the trophies for the game, we can see that only 44% of players have the trophy for killing Gascoigne, which means that's an enormous bounce rate when you remember that Gascoigne is the first real boss of the game. Effectively an organic gatekeep built into the game that has seemingly prevented so many players from seeing the meat of what Bloodborne has to offer. And yet, I defeated Father Gascoigne on my third try back in the day. My personal roadblock boss was the next one, the Blood-Starved Beast, which took me upwards of something like 25 tries to eventually defeat. But regardless, I was never put off, nor frustrated. I never felt truly defeated by the game. Perhaps I just got lucky, but I choose to see it as a testament to how much I was genuinely, unexpectedly enjoying Bloodborne on my first playthrough. I was completely wrapped up in the game. It was an obsession. And then, after breezing through the game a second time on New Game Plus, I sat and waited patiently, attempting to play other games that just weren't quite up to the same standard to fill the void. This was a new phenomenon for me, but I think something that Souls players had experienced a couple of times before. Finally, at the tail end of the year, the game's first and only expansion, The Old Hunters, arrived. My hunter and I stepped foot into Yharnam once again with aplomb. Everything felt immediately familiar as I slipped into this new nightmare, arriving in the DLC's first new area. Simply known as the Hunter's Nightmare, the first zone is a twisted, labyrinthine merging of central Yharnam and Cathedral Ward, where familiar architecture protrudes eerily from a bulging, sickly world, as though two planes have collided into one another in a violent and inescapable way. Recognisable Yharnam iconography, once proud and majestic, now sat sloped and slumped, as if being dragged into the very ground itself. The central fixture of this new plane of horror was a vile stream of blood that coursed through the city like a vein, like a crimson wound, as if to emphasise that yes, this terrible new place is in fact alive, baleful creatures supping at its accursed riverside. Perhaps the strangest and most alien element of this new landscape, however, was the sky above, and the monstrous sunlight that splintered forth from a broken star. Everything was now taking place under the unrelenting haze of daylight, painting Yharnam in a new light, the likes of which we'd never seen, exposing its underbelly to the elements and stripping back the usual atmosphere and oppressive nature. This was the true underlying evil of the city laid bare, stark and naked for all to see. Despite the haunting scenery, however, I worked myself back into the game with ease, and even the intimidating new hunter enemies who were roaming the nightmare, sporting the expansion's exciting arsenal of weapons, didn't give me too much trouble, as they are immensely susceptible to being parried. My hunter was a pretty high level as well, it was only New Game Plus 2, and I felt unstoppable. The old hunters was easy. Again, it's not that I wasn't dying, of course I was, I'm sure I probably took a boom hammer to the face at least once, but the game again never frustrated me, to the point where I had to walk away and admit defeat. Of course, again, there were times where I had to go back out into the world and farm blood echoes, but nothing ever felt so insurmountable. And yet, unbeknownst to me, a spectre loomed ever large over my entire playthrough of the DLC so far. Something awaited me in the darkness ahead. And finally, I arrived at the location of the expansion's first boss, a sinister, suffocating dungeon chamber drenched in blood and littered with bodies, fittingly called the Underground Corpse Pile. After tearing through the main game's bosses earlier, I stepped into Ludwig's den with a boastful pride, an air of hubris and complacency. New Game Plus number 2. Bah, this'll be a cakewalk. Ludwig, a figure regarded as a fable in the main game, sat menacingly and misshapen in the shadows. When he finally revealed himself to me, he wasn't the man of legend that I knew. Instead, like many of Yharnam's once upstanding citizens, he had become a monster, but this was unlike anything we'd seen before. A maelstrom of malformed madness that sat on a grotesque bed of legs. Two heads hung from his gigantic shoulders, and neither was human. One was drooping and horse-like, with a lolling, gnashing mouth and eyes that rolled in their sockets, while the other was literally a gaping hole filled with unblinking eyes, a symbol of Ludwig's own transgressions, and the transgressions of his healing church. Perhaps it was with a heretic irony that I faced him with his own weapon, the Holy Blade. The fight began, and with an animalistic scream, he was upon me. Like the decaying world of Bloodborne itself, Ludwig was constantly oppressive, unforgiving, and bore down unending, slamming me against walls and tossing my hunter across the room, sending ripples through the sea of blood beneath us as my health quickly evaporated. I tried to gather myself and use what the game had taught me. I dodged to his side and attempted to stay there as one should when faced with all large beasts, hacking away at his back legs and trying to stay out of range of, well, everything else going on at the front, but every single time he subverted me. Sometimes with a violent twist or a charge, sometimes with something as simple as bucking his back legs outwards, again akin to a horse, eliminating the one safe space I thought I'd found. Every time I thought I had him worked out, Ludwig revealed another new trick, in what seemed to be an endless bag of them. Sometimes he'd leap into the air and come crashing down onto me, where only a well-timed roll might suffice. Or he'd charge at me with an impossible fury, ramming into my hunter with such force as to send me flying into a dank corner of the battlefield, then at his mercy with barely a sliver of health left, if it didn't just kill me outright. Were I to escape his thrashing hooves, he'd spit some strange fluid at me that would melt my health away to cinders. Upon discovering I could call a hunter called Henriette to my aid, I did so, despite my own long-standing self-imposed rule of never summoning, never calling for help. But once Ludwig had trampled her to death, his dead-eyed gaze would fall upon me once again. Of course, looking back now, in retrospect, Ludwig is just like any other boss in Bloodborne. Extremely well made, telegraphed, and you can work it out with the requisite patience, with the requisite skill. But I don't know if it was just my mentality or what, but I did not have it in me at the time. Nowadays, I look upon Ludwig as being one of, if not the greatest boss in the entire game. But back then, it was a real struggle. This felt like an enormous difficulty spike. After fighting tooth and nail to shave away his health, I remember finally bringing him to the brink, and it took everything I had to get his health bar down to the midpoint. But as soon as I did, everything changed. It's interesting. Looking back, Bloodborne doesn't really do phase transitions that often, not to this degree, and not accompanied by a cutscene or any such pomp and circumstance. These days, they are all over the place, but this was clearly an enormous deal. And Ludwig's transition from a cursed beast to Holy Blade is the single greatest in certainly not only Bloodborne, but possibly any Soulsborne game. As the monstrous Ludwig collapsed to the ground, his eyes quivered with a strange, almost human sadness before they began to glow. From the darkness, a shimmering sword, bathed in moonlight's aura, appeared, and he took it and wielded it as if to show me that I could never have truly mastered his own holy blade from the beginning. And in an instant, I was swept aside. And eventually, after 30 or so attempts, the session dragged late into the night in what felt like uncharted territory. I put down the controller. For the first time in my Bloodborne career, I was struck with a sobering realization. I can't do this. Humbled, I resolved to return to Ludwig when my hunter was more powerful, and I was more suitably prepared for seemingly what the DLC had in store. My pride had been trampled and crushed by the hooves of the first boss. It seemed that after beginning to master the game and settling into my style of play, and yes, even growing complacent, realizing that I was at least serviceable at a game that I originally thought I had no business playing, I had forgotten what it really meant to play Bloodborne. I had forgotten what it meant to take up residence in this world. Dread and crushing defeat are commonplace. Yharnam is no playground, and new challenges, new hurdles, new fights are not made to be coasted through. In the lore of this city, the once grand and proud have long since fallen from grace. That same notion is true of the players who dared to take a leap into the abyss. Yharnam, and to that extent Bloodborne, is a cruel and demanding mistress. The rewards are great, but often punishment is greater. And in some cases in Bloodborne, punishment is the reward. Well, I returned to the Forbidden Woods a broken man. I wasn't seeking refuge, but power. Pushing on through the darkened woods, I gathered blood echoes and blood vials, enough to bolster my level and health respectively. And a big shout out goes to the skeleton man by the gate just outside of Ludwig's lair, who drops a guaranteed 5 vials every time you kill him. That poor guy has suffered a lot of abuse. But for me, the Forbidden Woods has always offered an excellent farming route, straight from the entrance all the way until the first snake-headed enemy, roughly the first half or so of the area. It's an easy enough route to barrel through and doesn't take all that long. By the end of each trip, I'd accrued almost 250,000 echoes, enough for one level at this point. And of course, this repetitiveness is a central part of Bloodborne's nature, of the Soulsborne bloodline baked into the game. The eternal grind that forces players to grow stronger, both in character and mind. Defeat is natural in Bloodborne, and it's the very essence of the game, and it feeds into that sense of reward. And so, after leveling my character an indeterminate number of times, I returned to the DLC. Gripping the holy blade in my hands, I stepped into the bloody dungeon. Of course, he was there, his wait for me undying, his horrible face emerging from the shadows with a bone-chilling screech. This time, however, I stepped into his bloody den feeling a little different. Gone was the out-of-place and unearned arrogance that caused me to fall. In its place, I saw Ludwig the Accursed for what he was. A fantastic boss, but one that would undoubtedly kill me again and again. And even after leveling, even after grinding, he did, of course. But he was beatable. He had to be, just as all who had come before him. Applying fire paper to my weapon, I ran at him again and again. By now I saw his first leap coming every time. It's almost always the same. I weaved to the side and struck him with a burning swipe. A couple of hits in, and I was out again. I backed off, observing, waiting. He did the same, and for a few tense seconds we circled one another. His horse head was low to the ground, and even though his eyes were glassy to the point where I couldn't see his pupils, I knew his eye was upon me. He made the next move and charged, and we fought back and forth for what felt like hours, tension gripping my hands. It was now becoming routine that I'd at least make it through to the second phase, that I brought him down consistently. But then he would reach for his sword, his partner, his guiding moonlight, his true mentor that had always been by his side. The second act would now begin. Through waves of glistening emerald, Ludwig swung his sword at my hunter in a delicate dance. The vestiges of his humanity returned to him for one final glorious bout. I applied my knowledge and moved behind him, hacking away at his legs at every opportunity, making sure to watch for the telltale signs of a shockwave blast or a hailstorm of green light from above. Victory was in sight. I lunged and he turned, swinging his massive, almost ethereal blade like a ghostly pendulum, carving through the darkness. In a momentary lapse of patience, plagued by the cocktail of greed and desperation that afflicts all who play these games and see that window of victory shrinking, I was struck and my hunter slammed into the ground, crumpled, and I was dead once again. But ultimately, that's all it takes, right? To come so close and to know it can be done, to make God bleed, even after believing it impossible. Eventually the time would come, of course. After a bitter and bloody clash, with an inhuman shriek, Ludwig at last collapsed to the floor like a felled tree, disappearing in a cathartic burst of blood and mist. Despite the midnight hour, I let out an audible cheer as he vanished, represented in-game, of course, by my hunter throwing his hands up to the sky in jubilation. With my hard-earned victory, I had remembered what it meant to play Bloodborne. Wins don't come easy. Bloodborne is a masterpiece in a number of ways, and making the player suffer in seemingly never-ending oppressive darkness is almost at the top of the list. Above that, though, is the richly rewarding sense of satisfaction it bestows on those who make it out of the shadows, who make it out alive. Bloodborne demands a lot from its players. Patience, timing, concentration, repetition, and respect, but above all it demands skill and perseverance, that willingness to try and try again. Drunk on blood, like the hunters who occupy the nightmare, it seemed I had forgotten that. Alright guys, but that's it for today's video, my first video celebrating the 10th anniversary of Bloodborne, a personal story taking you back in time 10 years to when the Old Hunters DLC first dropped. And yes, I do consider the Old Hunters to be one of the pillars that truly makes Bloodborne the masterpiece that I think it is today. It is absolutely essential to play this if you are a fan of Bloodborne, and you really are doing yourself a disservice if you somehow, by this point in time, 10 years later, haven't gotten around to it just yet. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the DLC, The Old Hunters, down in the comments below. This was a look and appreciation of the boss Ludwig, which is probably my favourite boss in all of Bloodborne, though I'm not entirely sure about that just yet. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks' time, I think, in particular, but I'd love to hear all of your thoughts about Bloodborne, the DLC, The Old Hunters, the boss battle with Ludwig, the bosses in The Old Hunters in general. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. But that's it from me, guys. As always, make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, if you enjoyed today's video. So many people still aren't subscribed who are watching the content, so I really would appreciate that extra step to help push the channel to its next major milestone. But of course, thank you all so very much. Simply being here and watching the videos is a massive help, and it does mean the absolute world to me. Alright everyone, thank you again for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and let's talk games again.